Welcome to the Zoology Podcast, hosted by me, Samuel Richardson. I thought for this month's podcast we could cover a happy outcome in the zoological world, and that's how changing opinions, increasing knowledge, and positive human action have allowed Britain's red kites to go from nearly extinct in these isles to becoming increasingly common sight in many parts of the country. The red kite, scientific name Milvus milvus, are up to 70 centimeters in length, have a wingspan of up to 180 centimeters, and weigh a maximum of 1.3 kilograms. This makes them a medium-sized bird of prey. They are related to more other well-known birds of prey such as eagles, harriers, and buzzards. Now, red kites are beautiful birds, possessing a distinct forked tail from where they derive their name of kite. They have plumage of mixed ginger, auburns, browns, and blacks, with their faces, underside of their tails, and wings being white. Well, except for their primary flight feathers, which are black. When their wings are viewed from below and spread out, this coloration makes it look like their wings have long black fingers attached to a white wing, which I think look nifty. These birds are mostly scavengers, and they can be seen eating roadkill such as rabbits. However, they are known to actively hunt small mammals, such as mice and shrews, but they won't turn their beak up to small birds, amphibians, or reptiles if given the chance. And this is good because these food sources are normally found where the red kites call home, which is broadleaf woodlands, valleys, and at the edge of wetlands. They can even be found inhabiting suitable habitats up to an altitude of 800 meters. That's 2,600 foot, or 433 6-foot tall men standing upright on each other's heads. This habitat variation has allowed the red kites to be present all across Europe, from Portugal to Ukraine, from Italy to Sweden. There are even populations in the North African country of Morocco, though many of the birds, although not all, will migrate from Europe to Algeria, Tunisia, and even eastern Anatolia to breed. This geographic, ecological, and diet variation has allowed the red kite to avoid the great population declines experienced by many other species, although across Europe, certain populations such as those in Germany or France have undergone about a 10 to 20% drop in total population from the 1950s. Though these, like most red kite populations, are currently listed as stable. This means the red kite is not overly threatened with extinction currently. The International Union for Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, ranks the red kite as least concern on their red list, and it's not hard to see why when there are over 50,000 red kites across Europe and North Africa, with about 25,000 breeding pairs. This lack of concern, however, could not be said for the populations which made Britain their home. Historically speaking, in Britain, that is England, Scotland and Wales, the red kite was seen as a detestable creature due to them having to survive on carrion and rubbish. Even today, many kites are known by those in the British Army as shite hawks. This detestability can be attested to in Shakespeare's King Lear, where Shakespeare describes a woman as being as detestable as a kite. While in mid-15th century Scotland, King James II decreed that red kites should be killed wherever it is possible to do so. Down south, in England and Wales, they were a little more tolerant of the red kites because they kept the streets free of carrion and rubbish, but this was only until the introduction of the Tudor vermin laws under King Henry VIII. It seemed he liked killing more than just his wives. The red kite was thought to steal food from farms, and this justified under the vermin laws that bounties were to be placed on them and paid to those people who could produce the body of any animal classified as vermin. You would get a penny for each red kite corpse. That's about £2 in modern British pound sterling, or nearly $3 American. This quickly affected the red kite population in Britain, and it got even worse during the turn of the 19th century, as the enclosure movement allowed for the formation of large shooting estates, the owners of which viewed the red kites as an awfully appealing practice target. I don't know if you've ever seen the way a red kite moves, quite a slow manner in which it will just suddenly turn on a wing and shift, so I could see how that could be an attractive target, as bad as that is. But because of these laws and circumstances, by the 20th century, red kites in Britain had been reduced to just a handful of birds located in central Wales. Now, from all the sources I checked, they all just say a handful of birds, which to me really isn't helpful. Does this mean 5 breeding pairs? 5 birds total? Or a single breeding pair? Because I don't know anyone who can hold more than 2 of these birds in their hands. But who knows? Putting that aggravation aside, recent genetic testing has shown that the remaining birds were all derived from a single female, and so the hope for these red kite survival in Britain looked bleak and inbred. What makes this even worse is that as the red kite became rarer and rarer, they also became a more tempting target for egg thieves. The Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, or RSPB, estimates that during the 20th century, a quarter of all red kite nests had their eggs stolen each year. So, without positive intervention, the red kite's days of surviving in Britain were looking numbered. But then, in 1903, the first Kite Protection Committee was formed, and they initiated the first nest protection schemes. This was then built upon by the UK government in 1954, when they passed the Protection of Birds Act, which criminalised disturbing or taking eggs from a wild bird's nest. This legislation gave a fortitude to organisations like the RSPB to institute more sophisticated egg protection schemes, and these schemes were backed by law, and so they were very successful. So much so that by 1960, egg theft was no longer regarded as a serious problem, threatening the continued survival of red kites in Wales. Now this is good news. It has allowed the Welsh population to stabilise, but still, the remaining birds were living in marginal habitats that couldn't support a large kite population. And while this protected them from humans, when the population did expand out of this habitat, they would run into problems of being poisoned or having their eggs poached again, and this hindered their expansion. For example, by 1990 the population was increasing, but not by much. Only 38 chicks were raised in Wales in that year. This basically means that it was very unlikely that the Welsh population could recolonise the rest of Britain anytime soon. And even if they could, it would be quite an inbred population, so not likely to be very healthy. Therefore, in 1986, the Wildlife Conservation Organisation of Natural England, Scottish Natural Heritage, and the RSPB formed a committee to discuss the feasibility of reintroducing the red kite in England and Scotland. The feasibility of this grand task was based on the assessment provided by the IUCN, and only if the red kite could pass all of their criteria could they be then reintroduced into their former habitat. So what were these criteria? Well, first, was the species historically present in the desired release area? Well, that's a big yep for our kites. They definitely were present in England and Scotland at one point. Next, is suitable habitat still present to support a viable population? And that's another big yes. Both England and Scotland still have vast suitable habitats for these birds. Well then, there also needs to be a clear understanding of what caused the species to become extinct in the desired area. If this disappearance was a result of human activity, and furthermore, the factors resulting in why the species cannot recolonise on its own accord. Well, the red kite passes this test also, for as we discussed earlier, their disappearance was mostly caused by human activity, and colonisation of their old range is being hindered by environmental and human factors. The last check is that the cause of extinction has been rectified. Well, the Welsh population is currently stable, and even slowly expanding in places, and this has lent some legitimacy to this being true, even though it has had problems. Okay, so the red kite passes all these checks really. But then you also need to assess the populations for which you are taking birds from. Can they pass the following criteria? Does the removal of birds for the reintroduction project jeopardise the survival of the population from which the bird is being taken? I think this is an obvious check, because there's no point causing yourself the same problem but only in a different location. And if no, you have to assess if the birds that are intended to be released are genetically close as possible to the former indigenous population. There are a number of reasons to choose closely related individuals. A key one being local adaptation is more likely to allow the transported birds to survive in a similar environment. Now, Great Britain is a wet, windy island that can get a little cold in the winter. Therefore, you would want individuals that are already genetically adapted to such a climate. There's little point of putting a bird genetically suited to hot African environments into northern Scotland, because all you're likely to end up with there is a dead bird. Now luckily, the red kite is one of the few species which can tick all of these boxes, so that's great. Therefore, in 1989, 6 Swedish red kites were released in North Scotland, while 4 Spanish and 1 Welsh bird was released into Buckinghamshire, England. The first successful breeding was recorded both in England and Scotland in 1992. being the first red kites hatched in those nations in hundreds of years. This success was then further intensified by the kites surviving their first few years in the wild and successfully breeding themselves. Now that's just wonderful. This type of great success can really motivate a conservation project, especially in the early days. And since this initial success, 90 more red kites were released at these sites, while populations derived from Welsh and Spanish birds have been established in the English regions of the Chiltern Hills, East Midlands, Yorkshire, Derwent Valley, that's in northeast England, and with a last introduction happening in 2010 in Cumbria. In Scotland, red kites were brought from Sweden and Germany and have established communities in north and central Scotland, while to encourage gene transfer between English and Scottish populations, 100 red kites which were bred in the Chilterns and North Scotland were released in Dumfries and Galloway in 2001. The great news is that in 2020, there were over 10,000 red kites across Britain, so this introduction effort has been a wonderful success. So what is next for Britain's red kites? Well, it seems the discrimination that historically the kites experienced has nearly all but vanished in Britain, being replaced with fascination and goodwill. This view is even held by estates managers, who once were a key cause of the birds' decline, but now these managers know that these birds pose no risk to their game shooting interests or livestock. The RSPB even monitors red kite populations which nest and are protected on game reserves. I think a key indicator of the British people's love for these birds is that in 2007, Wales voted the red kite as the nation's favourite bird, which I bet is welcoming news to the 600 breeding pairs which currently exist there. Honestly, I think you couldn't ask for a better species recovery outcome, because this means that the main drivers of the red kite's destruction have vanished. And when you couple this with the vast suitable habitats that exist in Britain, the long-term survival of the species in these fair isles is far more likely. However, everything isn't all rosy. Red kites are still killed through poisoning, as a scavenge bait left out by foxes and crows. There has also been recorded cases of kites being poisoned through rodenticides, and by collisions with power cables. However, research is currently being conducted by organisations such as the RSPB to solve these issues. Overall, red kites seem to have a bright future in Britain, with all populations doing well. Well, except the northern Scottish population, which is currently stuck at about 35 pairs, due to numerous poisoning incidents. The RSPB believes that it is human persecution which is restricting this population's growth, and honestly, I can believe it. I used to work up in the Highlands, and have talked with many people who know what an issue poisoning and trapping of birds is up there. From what I understand, many estate keepers want to keep their estates clean from birds like crows, and will turn a blind eye when their gamekeepers illegally leave out poisoned bait or place traps to capture these crows. Now obviously bait like this is gold for a scavenger species like the red kite, and therefore it's easy to see are being so heavily affected by these actions. Now due to the remoteness of such estates, they are hard to police, so I think that the only course of action is education. Or perhaps better, making it financially appealing to have red kites present on site. In places like Wales, local economies have benefited immensely from green tourism initiatives, such as kite feeding stations and birdwatching spots. These bring large amount of visitors to the area, and these visitors with them bring wealth into the rural communities. I think it is this, that the birds are a money generator which will cement their existence in Britain for their upcoming future, which overall places a very gold tint on what is a very successful Great British population rescue story.